Welcome to lecture 15, 16, I don't know. In the previous lectures, we have introduced transition path theory. Transition path theory, sorry for the noise. It's e-learning means I'm actually lecturing from home. Just a second. Leon, chiudi la porta per piacere. La chiudo. Ok. Okay, sorry. One of the problems that I've one of the feedbacks that I got from my students in the previous versions of this course is that apart from transition path theory, it's kind of interesting per se, but it's difficult to see the usefulness of it because of a lack of literature and in textbooks and applications. So what I'm going to do today is to show you unpublished result that we're sending for publications probably tomorrow. So this is sort of an insider view. But the reason I want to do that is that because these studies are useful. In these studies, we've made use of the concepts to sort of convince the reader that there was unexpected phenomenology in a given system. So I think it's a decent way of understanding why these concepts are quite useful in real research-wise. So in particular, what we are interested in is in understanding the role of transition path density and transition current. And so what, typically these concepts are useful when you look at a new event, a new process, a new system, and you want to characterize it theoretically. And in particular, in our case, we were looking at an active Brownian particle. This is a huge, huge field of research recently. What happens to Langevin dynamics if you make your particle just not simply a passive particle, but an active one? And the reason, well, this is not something you need to remember, just for your personal culture. The interest into active particles is that they provide great models for both biology, say bacteria, or for nanotechnology of the future, making artificial life objects like artificial bacteria that can chase for food, chase for nutrient, propagate by burning internal sources of energy. Bacteria burn ATP, the normal cells fuel, but nanotechnology can use different kind of energy providing system. So basically this is an intrinsically non-equilibrium system that violates microscopic reversibility and Markovianity and a certain number of concepts. So many of the results of transition path theory, such as the connection between the commuter and the densities, do not apply. Nevertheless, you can still define the density of points along transition pathways and the current along transition pathways in very similar ways. So the qualitative description of the reactions is still applicable. And so the interest into these objects was not only because people want to see what happens when you go beyond equilibrium situations, but also in technology. And what we discovered, and by looking at the TPT, transition path theory distribution, is that the mechanism of the reaction is completely different from those of passive particles. So as soon as you provide your Brownian particle a little engine to move in one direction by itself, then the way it reaches for food is completely different from the way it reaches a standard Brownian particle. Just to give you an idea and give you a setting, let me define what is an active Brownian particle model. It is a particle model obeying a specific Langevin equation. In 2D, you have your standard Langevin equation. You have your standard noise. But in addition to that, you have a driving force which is responsible, which is which is taking care of the fact that you have an internal propulsion system. So v is a scalar called the drift velocity, u is a unitary vector at time I, which is basically a versor telling you in which direction you get a propulsion. I will show it in a minute. You have your standard delta t. U of I is the cosine of an angle at time I and the sine of an angle, and the angle obeys a stochastic diffusion equation. So typically what's going on is that you have a Brownian particle that is being pushed along a direction u with a vector v. And in addition to that, he gets kicks from the environment and dissipation. So this is the, for instance, you can imagine this v to be provided by the flagella of a bacteria, or the tail of a sperm cell, or other nanotechnological devices to provide this. And clearly, the presence of this unbalances the detailed balance conditions. And although the bath is in equilibrium, the dynamics of this particle is always non-equilibrium. So, and also Markovianity is lost because you start pushing in this direction. By the time it takes a finite time for fluctuations on the angle to reorient the pushing in another direction. So there's an intrinsic persistence that depends on the typical size of the rotation diffusion constant. And it turns out that people can measure the amount of activity in this system as a function of what is called the Peschlet number, which is given by V3, 4 d over d tilde, sorry, d theta. So this is a dimensional parameter. When this parameter is 0, there is no activity. When this parameter is large, the particle is driven by the activity. Now, you can study the dynamics of this particle by performing long molecular dynamics simulation or performing more advanced path sampling techniques, and we used and adapted one of them. But this is not, of course, what I wanted to tell you. The paper will be online, you can read it. I cannot show you directly the picture of the paper because of copyright reasons. I'm not sure that the journals we're going to send allows for original figures to be published prior to receiving the paper, so I had to draw. So if the problem that we looked at and where we used transition path theory was one in which you have the simplest possible problem to be reactant, basin, product, which we call the target, and we have a barrier here. Now, this is a prototypical problem for target search. You have bacteria here in the reactor, they want to find food here. Now, if this bacteria were passive particle, then it is quite simple to convince you that the most probable way that the bacteria reach the target at low temperature is by propagating across gradient of potential energy. This is called the minimum energy path. Now, in one of my last lectures, in the bonus lectures, I'll probably touch on this problem of path sampling and dominant reaction pathways. But I want to leave plenty of time to develop field theory, statistical field theory. So under the specific constraint of this year, I will not digress on that in these lectures for now. So just believe me that if you have a low particle, low temperature, a Brownian particle, the most probable way a Brownian particle will reach there would be very close to just climbing the barrier. This is the equivalent of a classical trajectory, which is the most probable trajectory in an ensemble of possible trajectories. Now, if you were to draw TPT distributions, then in this particular system you will find something like this. So let me redraw the reactant, the product, the barrier top. Let me call T the product. And let me now imagine to draw where the transition path density will be large. The transition path density will be large here and becoming even larger here, and maybe a little bit like this. Right. Why? Because transition pathways normally propagate here, but when you get very, very close to the product, remember the Q, 1 minus Q, and Q term will kill the densities here, because most of the time you visit this density because you are exploring from the target, and you visit this point because you're exploring from the reactant. If I were to draw the fields of transition current, it will be something like this, obviously. Clearly x is the reaction coordinate for this simple system, so the isocommuter line will be locally orthogonal to x. And of course you can draw this everywhere, but the density of this current will be 0, because remember the current is proportional to the Boltzmann factor. So when you visit high energy regions, you can still draw arrows, but the modulus of that current will be very, very, very small. So basically here I should draw very small arrow. Well, this is just to set the stage, nothing unexpected. That's how a reaction should happen in 1D. Now, I'm bringing this up because when you compute the very same two stochastic descriptors, including some significant activity from the particle, well, something radically different happens. So first let me draw you the typical transition path density. It looks like this. It's actually the opposite. And so is the current. So basically the current does something like traveling here, 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 and very little in between. Well, there is something in between, a secondary channel here. So typically, when you look at this cannot be. But then after you plot this distribution, you realize what happens. There is this persistence direction of the drive. Now, either the transition pathways are those that make it to the product. So if you were lucky enough to have your initial velocity already in the direction of the product, then you go straight across the product very fast because you have an engine, like a boat, and you make it on the other side very shortly. But if you're not lucky and say you were starting from here, then this will lead you nowhere. And before you can make it to here, it takes forever and eventually go back to react. There is, however, a full other bunch of ways you can get to the target. And hence, since you have energy, now you're no longer confined to the 1/2 kT surface, because you're not in equilibrium. You have your own fuel to burn. And so typically what happens is that particle that shoot in all this quadrant here with initial velocity, they immediately reach a very high energy surface, and then the potential energy is so high and steep they can bend the vector of velocity and let you surf high energy region until you land to the product by surfing high energy surfaces. So why I'm telling you this? This is initially all counterintuitive, but the use of the stochastic descriptors eventually are the right tools to understand what's going on. So I guess, although I couldn't make you use this with your own hands, I think it provides you at least a motivation why stochastic descriptors of TPT may be really important and very workable tools in the statistical mechanics of complex problems. Okay, I think it's enough for this very short lecture.